Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
Today, we're going to be talking about road to the cloud. And this conversation has been prompted because of another customer that Adam and I talked to. And I was thinking about it this week, and I thought it'd be a really good topic to talk about because there are still a lot of organizations that are dependent on on-premise infrastructure. And this was a smaller customer, and I think as we talked through it, they needed some help with a roadmap to get to the cloud, to try to start migrating to the cloud. They had a couple of components there, but as we talked to them, we kind of gave them a checklist of, hey, this is what you do first and this is what you do next. And it helped. And so I thought we'd have a conversation because as we talk through this, and Microsoft actually has a document on all of this, and it's very comprehensive. We're going to talk through some of them and give you what Microsoft calls the states of transformation. That way, in your head, you can picture where you are in this journey and then where you might want to go. And I would say most organizations probably won't be at the far end, which is 100% cloud, but there may be components that you take from there and implement it into where you want to be for your organization.
We were talking about this in the pre-show, and I made the comment as we were reading through the notes that I felt like the 100% cloud state, is it the fifth state, was really aggressive for a lot of enterprises given current day technology. And so this is going to be one of those interesting conversations where I don't actually know if you should aim for state 5 yet. I think that will come, of course. Everything is moving in that direction. But this is actually one of those rare times in which you don't look at that final state and you wish you were there. And now, if you're a smaller organization, startup, a smaller company, it might be a desirable state now. It might be an achievable state now. I think for enterprises, it's maybe a little much yet. I'm as much of a proponent of moving to the cloud as I am. I still think there are a lot of workloads that require an on-premises identity infrastructure, the continued use of Active Directory domain services as an example. And so while we need to have an eye toward the retirement of those things someday, that day has not yet come, especially for large enterprises. So this will be fun to go through. And like Andy said, kind of keep an eye on where you are and where you want to be. But just want to call that out before we go through it. That state 5 is pretty aspirational for a large enterprise yet.
So when organizations are shifting from on-premise to the cloud, they usually start with identity and access management activities. And that's usually starting with shifting from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory or some other identity provider in the cloud. When you do this transition, there are 3 pillars that you're looking at. First one is applications. And so that's applications, resources, and any underlying domain joined servers that you may have that are hosting those applications. Devices, which are mainly focused on on-premise domain joined devices, client devices, and then users, humans, non-human identities, attributes, and resources that are accessed from those devices. So those are the 3 pillars. And as you're shifting to the cloud, there are different things that you can do. Like, for example, with applications, you can start using SaaS applications with SSO from Azure Active Directory. Devices, you can move to either hybrid or Azure Active Directory joined. Users, you start syncing those users or groups, or start creating native users within the cloud. So there's a whole bunch of things that are part of this transformation when you're moving. And like I said, Microsoft has these 5 states of transformation. And we're going to talk through each one of them. And the goal is really for you to understand where you are as an organization today, and then maybe where you want to move to. So the first state is called cloud attach. And this is where most companies are already. If you are not in cloud attach, you're probably very legacy. I don't know of any customers now that I've talked to in the last couple of years, which are only on-premise, meaning you're using Exchange on-prem, you're using perpetual licenses of Office, you're only domain joined machines, you have no presence in the cloud. I don't know of any orgs that are still there. And if there are, it's a few and far between. Most orgs are in the cloud attached. They are using Active Directory, but they are syncing their users generally to Azure Active Directory, and their devices are usually registered within Azure Active Directory. You need to have people who are proficient in both Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, or your other IDP, in order to support those users and devices that are there. You're mainly managing through group policy or other on-premise device management tools, and your users are provisioned within Active Directory. So if you have an HR system, it's pulling like via LDAP or something like that to provision your users, or you're manually doing it. And you're authenticating to Active Directory or other federated servers like ADFS to manage, your M365 or other on-premise tools. Now, again, you may not fully be in this state. Maybe you're using AAD or IDP, another IDP to authenticate to your applications. So if you're cloud attached, you're usually still mainly on-premise with just a hair of things in the cloud.
It's worded in the documentation that we looked at to generate this conversation that most customers are in or beyond this state. I'd almost argue most customers are beyond this state today. This is very rudimentary. This is basically you've set up Azure AD Connect. Otherwise, you're still doing everything the way you've always done them. Your devices are domain joined. You're still fully using things like ADFS or SiteMinder or Oracle Access Manager for your access to any federated applications. And those all are calling back to an on-premises identity infrastructure. Everything is really on-premises based. I'd say, honestly, to give a lot of credit, most enterprises I speak with are at least a little bit beyond this stage. They're more in state 2 hybrid, which is kind of a good segue to that.
Yeah, in the hybrid state, you start enhancing stuff through the cloud. And so you're in this state, most organizations, the admins start to have more expertise in Azure AD or your cloud IDP. And your user and devices are still mostly on-prem, but like, let's say you move your Windows clients to hybrid Azure AD join. And to what you said, Adam, a lot of orgs that we talk to now, to my surprise, actually, when I ask them if they're hybrid Azure AD joined, the answer is yes.
Almost universally, yes.
And so if you are not hybrid Azure AD joined, you are now in the minority, in my opinion here, based on anecdotal evidence, I would say. I don't have any actual numbers, but most, like you said, Adam, most orgs are in this position. And then you're using SaaS applications that are integrated with Azure AD for authentication, like Salesforce or ServiceNow. And again, when I say Azure AD, I also mean other IDPs like Okta and Ping, just using a cloud identity provider. Legacy applications, a lot of organizations are using VPN, but, if you're trying to get to a hybrid state, you might go through some other service like Azure AD application proxy, where you're not standing up a tunnel and you're just using that proxy to get back to your on-premise environment. Self-service password reset and password protection is enabled. Self-service password reset is a feature of any cloud IDP, but password protection, I think, is fairly unique to Microsoft because we have the ability to protect not only the cloud identities, but also your on-premise users. So you can implement that for your domain controllers as well. So those are, again, a little bit of hybrid. And then hopefully you're using your cloud IDP to authenticate back. So that's where I said, like, in most orgs are probably using at least that part by now. Maybe you're not everything, but I think you're correct, Adam, that hybrid is probably where most orgs are today that we're talking to, at least the big ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you said, anecdotally, of course, we support enterprise-sized customers that are usually about 1,500 seats or bigger. We solely talk to manufacturing customers, mostly in the Western United States. So that's kind of cuts down. It's not a representative sample of all enterprises since it's industry focused and it's geographically focused, but it's still, I think, a diverse enough customer set that you can draw some reasonable conclusions that it's a relatively representative sample. And especially, and I'd say unfairly, there's the perception that manufacturing is sometimes not as advanced from an IT perspective. I'd say most of our customers are pretty sophisticated in a lot of things they're doing. The production environments are challenging for them to manage, but that's not really a subject of today's conversation. As far as hybrid goes, when you think of state 2, and really the big differentiators from state 1, most of these are not that impactful in the big scheme of things. So this is still, to me, like you've done the easy stuff, pardon the tire phrase, the low-hanging fruit. But moving to hybrid Azure AD join is essentially domain join plus. Like, you're not really changing anything you're doing. You're just adding a little bit more capability. Moving cloud native applications like Salesforce and ServiceNow to a cloud native IDP is not really a big step. They're already cloud-based. And so if you're going to authenticate them in a cloud-based manner, great. That's a great first step away from an ADFS federated authentication anyways. Zscaler is really popular for connecting to legacy apps. Azure AD App Proxy, you probably already own it. And it's actually pretty straightforward to stand up and does some really amazing stuff with transforming legacy authentication methods to modern authentication methods. And so you can have, like, as an example, you can have a really old app that used to require like IE6 and integrated Windows auth with Kerberos and blah, 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 all this Windows specific stuff to function. You can wrap that with Azure AD App Proxy, and now your Mac users can go hit it, and they'll just use their native Azure AD sign-in to sign into it. They don't get prompted weird like IWA prompts or anything like that. They get a seamless single sign-on experience, and by the way, they don't need VPN. And by the way, you probably already own it. So that's one of those things. Sure, do you maybe have to redirect how a user gets to that app? Okay, but for the most part, again, like not terribly like impactful user facing. Like to a user, it just more or less looks the same. And they don't need to know that this app didn't require VPN anyways, especially if you're still using a persistent VPN. So to me, like state 2, great, get there. But none of this is like a heavy lift. None of this is like super impactful stuff. This is like the next evolution in the journey. And that's how it has to be, right? You have to build confidence in the technology. You have to build capability within your people to implement the technology. And that's part of the process. And that's great. But I'd say if you, listener, have identified your org as a state 1, it's not that big of a lift to get to state 2. So I just want to kind of call out that as Andy describes this, the delta there, not very big. And I think we're going to start to get into some of the bigger steps with these next states.
The third state is cloud first. And so organizations probably spend the majority of their time in this state. And this is where you've already matured everything in the first 2 states for the most part. And now you are shifting everything and having that cloud first mentality. I think you spend a lot of time here because this is more impactful, as well as you mainly probably do it through attrition. And so it takes a lot of time to, like, as you get new applications, you're going to still have some in the old state and the new ones in the new state. Or maybe you are shifting Windows clients to Azure AD joined and managed through Intune or co-managed. You might do that through attrition, right? As people get new computers or new employees, they're going to be cloud joined, and then the old ones are still hybrid. So those are some examples. If you're using provisioning, you can use ECMA connectors, which can provision users and groups in Azure AD or other cloud IDPs for on-premise applications. And so there's ways to do that. Basically, you're thinking of the cloud first, where you are putting your users, your devices, and your applications. New groups can be created within Azure AD and managed within Azure AD instead of creating new groups within Active Directory and syncing those up. You can also shift file and print services to Azure AD. That's something that I don't see very often, but there is a capability called Cloud Print that you can use to not have any infrastructure. If you're using it with a supported printer, you don't need any on-premises infrastructure in order to print to that printer from an Azure AD joined device or a hybrid Azure AD joined device. If it's not supported with that printer, you can stand up a connector on-prem and then it'll talk through the connector and print. So there are ways to do that, to not have any infrastructure on premises in order to do print. I know printing is like this huge issue at a lot of companies, and how to get better printers and make sure that they're working with their users. So again, you're creating users and devices and applications first in the cloud is the idea in this case. And you're migrating away as much as possible from on-premise infrastructure.
So when you walk through this, my thesis was proven correct very quickly with one of the very first things you talked about. New Windows clients are joined to Azure AD and managed through Intune. Our most listened to episodes of the Blue Security podcast are some of our episodes where we've had Shannon Fritz, friend of the show, join us and talk about the benefits of moving your device identity to Azure Active Directory and what all that entails. And we've done 2 episodes on it, and you should go back and listen to them because they're still relevant and still very useful. But that, for a lot of customers, has been challenging because it's hard in a business world to justify like changing one thing to another when, at least initially, there's not a whole lot of new capability. It's just retiring technical debt that's not even end of life. Like, not to say like on-premises domain join, a lot of people might not even see as technical debt, because it's not like Microsoft's getting rid of Active Directory domain services anytime soon or anything like that, or that's going to be unsupported in a future version of Windows. Nothing like that's been announced. So from a pure perception of if we're trying to run away from end of life, there's nothing there. But long term, this is, of course, the direction we have very strongly advocated for. And there's work involved with that. You have to take all your group policy, you have to map that to equivalent capabilities in Intune, which there's now group policy analytics that will do a lot of that work for you. You have to figure out and make sure that legacy apps still work. You have to figure out and basically validate for yourself, because most of the time this works out of the box, but things like on-premises file shares, on-premises printing, that still works in Azure AD Join. A lot of people just never try it or never test it, and so they think it doesn't. So some of this is perception, some of this is reality. There is some work to do, but then moving to Intune, you don't have to move to Intune right away. You can do co-management with Configuration Manager and Intune. That's not really called out in here. It's just like you're purely managed by Intune. But remember, it says cloud first, not cloud only. So being co-managed is still totally allowed in like a cloud first state. So if you can Azure AD join your devices, they become managed with Intune initially, Intune can drop the configuration manager client on there. That's still cloud first. That is a cloud identity, device identity. It is managed by Intune first. It's the primary management plane on that device. Now you can kind of set those with the toggles in the co-management configuration. And then what you're trying to do is move more of those workloads to Intune over time and become even more cloud first. So, but in terms of lift, like that's a lift. And it's not something you're going to do for devices in service. Like Andy said, you're going to do it through attrition. It's the only way to really do it because there isn't, especially remotely, a way to just take a device and move it from on-premises domain join to Azure AD join. So now we're getting into stuff that's a bit of a lift, right? And some of the other things talked about, like, hey, in state 2, maybe you're federating like the big cloud SaaS providers like Salesforce and ServiceNow with Azure AD. In state 3, you're doing all of them. Anything you have federated, you've shut down ADFS or equivalent, SiteMinder or whatever, because everything's federated through your cloud identity provider now. And you've moved to that state. Now you're cloud first for all your applications. Again, a fairly sizable lift. So I'm not trying to like scare our listeners and say like, oh, you can never get here, but just saying like state 1, state 2, those come really fast and they come without a large amount of impact. Here, there is more potential impact, but there's potential benefit too. Think about all the benefit of when all of your devices in the field are just using a cloud identity, they have no dependency for on-premises network connectivity. If VPN breaks, so what? They still work. They can still log in. They can still be productive. They can still do everything. That's huge. That is now something you can go back and I know some people don't like saying this, but go back to the business, Lord business, and say, hey, we've improved resiliency and productivity because we've gotten rid of this major technical dependency. And so now in more use cases and in more places, our users can seamlessly continue to function. That is something the business can get behind and can see value in for sure, if you're articulating it correctly. And then things like, again, universal print, like print has been a nightmare its entire existence. Like there's not enough, if you find an IT person that doesn't hate printing, they haven't been in IT long enough. Because it's universally terrible. But moving a lot of that to the cloud, simplifying that infrastructure, I mean, it can't hurt, right? I mean, it can only go up from here with how bad printing is. So I see those as major wins as well. So there's a lot of benefit here. Oh, last one. New groups being created in Azure AD natively or Cloud IDP of choice. Those groups are probably going to be Microsoft 365 groups for the most part. And if you're creating those, then guess what? You get a SharePoint site, you get a Teams instance, you get a distribution list, you get a Exchange like little corner of the universe, and then all gets spun up automatically. And you can leverage that in other services like Power BI and Planner. All use M365 groups as well. So again, as you move to that model, you create more self-service opportunities. You automatically spin up productivity and collaboration services that group can leverage. And all of that happens automatically. That's got to be a time saver for IT in the long term as you move away from everything needs to be created on premises and it's going to use like Tivoli Identity Manager to do it or whatever. Like that's a win, especially getting to potentially a self-service model or a semi-self-service model. So I see this again, a lot of work, not minimizing the work, but also maximizing the opportunity and the benefits that come with it.
And I just want to explain universal print real quick because, again, most people haven't heard of it. I have a very, very rudimentary method of universal print on my home printer, right? This printer was purchased maybe 7 years ago, but it has connectivity to the internet. Mm-hmm. And it has capability within it where I can set up essentially a POP3 connection to my email, and I can just send my an email to the printer's email, quote unquote, and it will print that document. So, I mean, like that's like a rudimentary, HP or something is hosting some connection and it's connected through my POP3 S3, email like Gmail or something like that. And the printer has an email. So I'm just sending an email to my printer essentially, and it doesn't have any other connection. With Cloud Print, obviously there's a lot more infrastructure behind it. Microsoft is hosting it. You're probably authenticating through Azure AD. There's licenses involved in that and all. But that's kind of the idea, is that you just take a device from anywhere and you hit print, and there's printers that are available in buildings with no on-premise infrastructure that's required, and it just prints, right? So anyway, it's very cool stuff. The State 4, and I think, as we talked about in the beginning, large organizations may have a hard time or may never get to 100% cloud. I think for Microsoft, this is where we are, which is Active Directory minimized. We still have Active Directory on premises, but my devices are Azure AD joined. I can't even remember the last time I had to connect to my VPN. Most of our files are in SharePoint, and I was joking with Adam before the show. I was like, I've never connected to a file share since I've been at Microsoft. And I think you said, Adam, like you did long time ago when you first started. But when I started in 2018, my device was domain joined when I first got it. And actually, it was a horrible experience. It blue screened constantly. And I talked to my peers, and they're like, yeah, you should do this Azure AD join thing. And I was like, what is that? Like, you join it to Azure AD? And so it was very new back then. We're talking 6 years ago. And it was very lightweight at the time. No co-management, no SCCM agent. And the policies were just being built. So you're like cutting edge, and you basically had almost no management at that point. Now it's a little bit more robust, I would say. And, it's still a great experience. But everyone in the field is getting Azure AD joined devices, and all of our files are in SharePoint, and all of our applications are authenticated through Azure AD. And so this is where I think most organizations can aspire to get to, instead of provisioning on-premises servers for workloads, you're provisioning them in the cloud, in Azure or AWS or GCP or wherever you are, right? So you're using the cloud workload with high availability. You're not hosting physical servers. You may still have some. And that's where I think when I talk to customers, I tell them there's no one size fits all. You don't have to fully be in this thing, because maybe you have use cases. Like maybe your field and information workers are going to have Azure AD joined devices, but your kiosks on site that never migrate anywhere else, those are hybrid Azure AD joined. And so that helps, plan your transition. You can keep some there. You can keep some on-premise servers if you need them, and they're a very difficult lift, but everything else is in the cloud. So I think this is where most people should try to get to, is Active Directory minimized, where you really have very, very low dependency on it from day-to-day operations.
That was a funny conversation before the show. We started off kind of debating, okay, where's MSIT? Where's Microsoft IT sit? And we're like, is it state 3 or 4? And I think we settled on 4. And I dropped something on Andy that he was surprised to even hear, because I knew what domain my identity was in, and he didn't. Because like at Microsoft, we have like the Redmond domain, NTDev, North America, and then a whole bunch geographic around the world. I knew I was in the North America domain. And Andy Keslick laughed at the time that I said that, because it was just funny to hear us talk about like, oh, what domain are you in? I mean, my account is North America /AD Brewer is technically my Active Directory identity. And it's still there. I literally almost never use it for anything, because at this point, everything's been wrapped in some sort of cloud wrapper or whatever. So even really old legacy applications, like we still have an instance of Microsoft Identity Manager going. We call it ID Web internally at Microsoft. and it's aka.ms/idweb. Well, that's app proxy today. It used to be not. In fact, you used to not really be able to access it from a Mac because, perfect example, it was built on integrated Windows authentication, required Kerberos tokens and all that. And so on your Windows PC, you got single sign-on. On a Mac, it like spat out like a really weird like sign-in screen. And that's where you literally had to sign in with like your domain / username to sign into it because it wanted on-premises Active Directory domain services auth. And today it's wrapped in app proxy. And so sign into it from Mac, fine. Because as long as I'm authenticated to Azure AD, it's cool. I don't mean to get on a tangent, but just to say like the use of Active Directory is really minimized for us at this point and still there. And there are still some services that use it. There are still times even when I've had to go on a file share to get like a specific build of Windows or something, or like get a Surface driver or something internal. But like Andy said, like day to day, just never use it. Not on VPN. Everything's in a cloud service. Like everything we do day to day, it's in SharePoint or it's in Teams or it's in a SaaS application. Just never touch anything that's touching on-premises Active Directory. The one thing we still had was MFA server. We still had MFA server stood up for the longest time. And for the most part, I don't know if that's quite deprecated yet, but it's really close. And it's going to be deprecated for all orgs here, I think, this coming calendar year. But anyhow, this is, again, that model, I think, for most enterprises where you're going to want to try to get to today, because I think there's just going to be, a onesie twosie use case or application that still is going to be dependent. And certainly you should be planning future state of when can we eliminate that dependency? And when do we get to the point when we look around the room and say, any more ADDS dependencies? And the answer is no. And maybe you do get there. But I think for most orgs, as long as you're kind of minimizing the use of it, you can basically have your users exist in a world when for all theoretical versus real purposes, in the real world, they don't use it. So it's interesting because this is kind of the state where we live in our work world day to day and reading about it. One of the things it says in here was new users are provisioned through the HR provisioning capability are created directly in Azure AD. I don't actually, and see, this is where, again, none of these are like hard and fast rules. This is all just kind of a made up exercise. I don't think MSIT is there yet. I think identities are still created in on-prem Active Directory first and still synchronized to Azure AD. I don't know. Maybe not, but it's one of those things like, just because one of those, like, you're like, well, we're not going to do that yet. You don't go, okay, well, we're not in that state. Like, these are guidelines. It's not hard and fast rules. So.
In the state 5, this is 100% cloud. And I think, like you said, Adam, smaller organizations, startups, if I were to, have a new company, even if it was, a few 100,000 users, and I didn't have Active Directory, I wouldn't start there, right? I would start with the cloud first. And so you're just using a cloud identity provider. All your devices are Azure AD joined. You're doing lifecycle management, users, groups, all in the cloud. Network services. So this is really interesting. It's saying network services that rely on AD are relocated. This could also be in the previous state, but one of the things that Microsoft did many years ago now is get rid of firewalls at all of our office locations that aren't headquarters. So when I go to the Milwaukee location, or if I go to the Des Moines location, it's just a straight pipeline to the internet. There's no connection to CorpNet on there. There used to be like a CorpNet Wi-Fi network that your devices would automatically join to, and then a guest network that would be out. But now it is just the Microsoft Wi-Fi, and it's just straight out to the internet. If you need to get to CorpNet, you have to VPN from a Corp device. So that also kind of points to minimizing Azure or minimizing Active Directory to me, because again, your day-to-day users, you're just using the internet and using things like SharePoint or OneDrive or other cloud services. You're never having to connect to a file share. And even if you do, you could use these app proxies to minimize the impact to normal users. And so cloud 100%, obviously, that's pretty straightforward. If you're trying to get there, we'll go through this roadmap real quick, but most organizations are already somewhat there. Like you'll probably already have Azure AD Connect or the Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. Authentication methods. We recommend password hash because that gives you the capability to do password protection and other things. And you're hopefully, if you listen to our previous episode, you're already using MFA, you're blocking legacy authentication. And if you haven't gotten there, you definitely need to do hybrid Azure AD join for existing Windows devices. And then maybe for new ones, you start using Azure AD joined, right? We always say join a device to Azure AD and then just start using it. See what you can and cannot do, and then start building those policies. Start clean, because you can, like Adam said, use the GPO analyzer to pull in your GPOs for your devices, but a lot of them were probably created a long time ago, and you have no idea what they are supposed to do. So I always tell people, just join it, start using it. Oh, I need to sign into Microsoft Office. I can do that. Oh, I need to access this particular application. I need my VPN. Oh, I have to manually install it. Okay, well, let me create an Intune package to deploy that VPN client. I need my EDR solution, my AV agent. Okay, let me create a application to, package to deploy that. I don't want to keep on having to sign in. Okay, well, let me configure single sign-on or whatever, right? So there's a lot of things that as you start using it, you're like, this is what I need to do, and then you start building it out. You can't do it overnight. There's no magic solution. You just got to start and then go from there. At my previous organization, we had a policy in security where we said, if you're going to get a new application, it has to have SSO capability to our IDP. There are still applications out there that organizations will just, some random department will be like, oh, we need this tool. And then you find out that they have to use like some rudimentary LDAP authentication in the clear on your network. And you're like, oh, that's really bad. It should have native SSO capabilities built in. LDAP should be really, you should get rid of it, and then just have an exception process if it is a business critical application. Start migrating your stuff from file servers on-prem to SharePoint or other cloud solutions. Azure Files is actually really cool if you haven't used it. It is a fully managed file share in the cloud, and you can access it through standards like SMB and NFS, and you can authenticate to them through Azure AD, using conditional access, MFA, all the modern authentication protocols. So if you haven't looked at that, if you need like an SMB type of solution or just a file share that works a lot like a file share and not SharePoint, you can use Azure Files. And not many people know about that. So that would say, that's kind of the high level journey and what I would say to start looking at if you haven't done that already.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good overview. I'll just reemphasize password hash sync. If you're using still ADFS today for authentication to Azure AD, you don't have to take all the other applications off ADFS to make that move. Just to be clear, people get confused on that because they'll think like, oh, well, I have 100 apps that use that and I have to migrate all the source. No, you don't. Azure AD is just an app on ADFS, essentially. It's a big one. It's probably your busiest one, but it's still just one. Doesn't mean you have to turn it off, but you can move that one to what we call managed authentication with Azure AD. Password hash sync is one of those options, and it's the best option because it gives you full cloud high availability. Every other option has an on-premises dependency, which means if something happens with your connectivity or on-premises, you can have all the cloud mailboxes in the world, your users can't get to them because of something that happened on premises. And that to me seems frustrating. So password hash sync is far and away the best option. It gives you the cloud high availability. It gives you those other benefits like Andy talked about, like leaked credential detection, amongst others. So strongly recommend looking at that if you haven't already. Andy's point around just get started on Azure AD Join is 100% spot on. Again, plugging the Shannon Fritz episodes again, if you go back and listen to those, it's the same methodology we articulate in those episodes. Eventually, you just got to try it. Figure out what works, what doesn't, and layer in what you need to make it work. As I've been saying a lot recently, Windows management is a practice. And for a lot of organizations, it's a practice that's been built up over 2 decades. And it is not going to be trivial to learn a whole new paradigm of management overnight because you have 2 decades of experience in the other way. Be gentle on yourself and understand that it's going to take time and, yes, practice to get up to speed on that. And that's okay. But you're never going to get further along if you don't start. And I kind of compare it, to use my favorite analogy, it's the laundry problem, where when your laundry is piled up so bad you don't want to do it, versus if it's just one load of laundry, it's not a big deal. Just do 1 load of laundry. You don't have to solve it all right now. You just try it out. Try to solve one use case. And to Andy's point, I think earlier in the show, he said something about, I get in IT, we love homogeneous environments. We want all the same thing across the board, easier to support. I get it. I came from enterprise IT, Andy did too. However, we are having a more diverse workforce today than ever before. We have more use cases to solve than ever before, and not every use case demands the same solution. And I'd be willing to bet there are some use cases or some solutions that you can solve very elegantly with Azure AD Join today. And so that's a great opportunity to learn and practice in a real world scenario and get better and better at it. And then Andy kind of walked you through all the things you can do to bring those devices fully up to speed with, again, what you've spent 20 years investing in traditional domain join. So not going to get there overnight. Should not have the expectation of getting there overnight. It is a different paradigm, but it is not going to take you as long as it took back then. It's simpler, it's better, it's superior in a lot of ways, and it's pretty straightforward to get going. You just kind of have to understand some of the basics, and you'll take off and run with it from there. We have confidence in you, listeners.
One last thing on the devices, because I do think a lot of orgs struggle with this. Macs. Mm-hmm. You can register those within Azure AD. You can manage them through Intune. You can also deploy enterprise SSO so that applications seamlessly sign in. I was telling Adam that I haven't actually turned on my Surface laptop that's corporate issued in a very, very long time. And that if I were to travel, my day-to-day work computer actually is my MacBook. My MacBook Pro. I have it joined to Microsoft Corporate Intune. I haven't been able to find an application that I cannot get to on the Mac. It is, fully managed, and all my applications work. So that's what I would say. If you haven't tried it, definitely try using Intune with Mac. Of course, it integrates with Jamf as well. You can use Jamf to do the configuration and the deployment and still use Intune for your compliance. Mm-hmm. Linux as well. That we had a whole episode on Linux. You can now use Azure AD to authenticate to Linux VMs instead of having to manage those keys locally or through some other method. And then, look at VDI as well. If you have on-premise VDI, start shifting that to a cloud VDI solution like Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365. Those are going to be a lot more seamless. You can use modern authentication. Again, this is like reducing that dependency on Active Directory and then moving all of that stuff to the cloud. So, any final thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, a couple. Macs, people are always surprised by this, are absolutely first-class citizens in the Microsoft ecosystem today. Many years ago now, it was announced that the Office codebase is unified across all 4 major platforms. So Windows, macOS, iOS, and Android are all built from the same fundamental Office codebase. So the days of the Mac Office being an inferior experience that didn't have all the capabilities of the Windows clients, those days are gone. Like Word, Excel on the Mac, those are first-class apps. They're really great. Outlook is a little different functionality on the Mac. It's got kind of a different UI, but I like it. And it's got some really useful capabilities too. I find it easier in some ways to schedule meetings on Outlook on the Mac, and it does some really nice stuff. And again, I have my Mac Mini joined to the Microsoft environment. It is Intune managed. It dropped Defender for Endpoint on it. It dropped the VPN client on it. But for the most part, it's not heavy-handed management. Like this is still like, in my mind, my personal Mac. It's just my personal Mac I can use for work if I want to. Teams is great on the Mac. So like the whole idea that, Macs are really hard to solve for, they're different. Don't get me wrong. There is an entire career path for managing Macs, and it is a different set of skills. And even if you think like, oh, I'm an Apple enthusiast, I know how it works. Like I will tell you, I consider myself pretty well versed in the underpinnings of like how Mac OS and iOS function. And you can get pretty deep on the management stuff and lose me in a hurry, especially Mac management. There is a ton of complexity to that. And so I'd say honor that as a different practice and a different skill set. And don't expect somebody who's a veteran of Windows management to pick it up, because the paradigms are different. Different is not bad. Different just means different. And there are really, really great tools to help you with that management if you need more than Intune offers. And Intune offers a pretty fair and complete feature set today. Microsoft doesn't use anything else. We just do Intune management. And for our purposes, that's more than sufficient. If you need more, Jamf is available. There's great partnership with Microsoft there. So there's some really good options. Like it's totally doable to have a really first-class enterprise Mac experience today without degrading the Mac experience, I would mention as well. And then just one final thought, you kind of mentioned this briefly, but with a virtual desktop experience or VDI experience, you plugged Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365 is something you could look at. So with all of this work we've talked about, this journey to the cloud, road to the cloud, one of the things that would be really frustrating is if you had to redo all that work, right? One of the things I really, really like about Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop to an extent too, is that they leverage all of that work you've already done. So if you've moved to a state where we're ready to do Azure AD Join, we're ready to manage with Intune or maybe co-management with Intune plus Config Manager, guess what? W365 just inherits that automatically and uses that too. And so I think as we're all trying to, oh gosh, I'm about to roll my eyes because I'm going to say this out loud, do more with less. That's an opportunity to do that where you don't have to redo work or do rework to enable another experience. Because we all know there are use cases where you really just being able to deliver a desktop to someone, like desktop as a service, really, really valuable. And if we can reduce a lot of the complexity associated with that, that's again a benefit. You can go back to your management, you can go back to the business and talk about how much more efficient you've gotten at delivering that desktop experience to a person, whether that's on a physical device or whether that's on a virtual device.
Well, that was quite the show, and hopefully you learned something. If you do have questions, which I know many of you might, because this was honestly just a high-level overview, and we didn't really even dive really deep into any specific thing, definitely email us or tweet us or find us on LinkedIn. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you guys need to reach out. That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.